My name is Dylan Vaughn. I'm a short-term researcher here at the Middle East Institute, MEI, and we'd like to thank you very much for coming to this seminar today. We are very happy to be hosting here today Dr. Abraham Sellah, and we also want to thank all at MEI who organized this event. First, I'll introduce and talk a little bit about Dr. Sellah, and then introduce the panel name, and after about 45 minutes or so of the seminar, we'll open up for question and answer. So Prof. Abraham Sellah is currently the A. Ephraim and Shirley Diamond Chair in International Relations at the Department of International Relations and Director of the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations. These are both at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Dr. Sellah specializes in Middle East politics with special emphasis on inter-Arab and Arab-Israeli relations and regional and historical perspectives, and on Palestinian politics and society. His current research project focuses on foreign fighters in interstate conflicts in comparative perspective, which he'll be talking about today with the Arab-Afghan fighters. His most recent books include The Decline of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, Middle East Politics and the Quest for Regional Order, The Palestinian-Hamas Vision, Violence, and Adjustment, and then also the Continuum Political Encyclopedia of the Middle East. Okay? His talk today will be entitled State, Society, and Transnational Networks, the Case of the Arab Volunteers in the Afghan War, 1980 to 1992. I hope you can all join me for a round of applause for Dr. Sellah.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction, and good afternoon to all of you. I'd like to thank you for attending this seminar at the time of vacation and exams and all other issues that take you away from attending such lectures. This is a very important occasion for me because I've never been to Singapore before, and actually I never crossed the line between Israel and Jordan. So for me to go east, no, I visited Jordan, but I didn't cross the line between Jordan and Iraq, say this. So for me to go east of the Middle East is something very, very unusual. This project, as was mentioned before, is part of an attempt to look into a phenomenon that is not that much covered by the literature. Foreign fighters have become more and more interesting subjects in recent years, especially due to what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and previously because of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States. So people started to look into this whole phenomenon of global jihad as they started to define it. Those terrorist groups with an international agenda at the core of which is Al-Qaeda. And here and there in the literature, people go a little bit to the background of the 1980s and early 90s to speak about the emergence of this core group of Al-Qaeda. And how it came into being. But not many, actually very few, took any interest in understanding the phenomenon as a social result of state-society relationship. And the reason why I'm saying this is, or the reason why I'm connecting it to state-society relationship is because from a previous study that I conducted on volunteers who came to fight in Palestine in 1948, both Muslims, Arab Muslims, and Jews, each to fight on the side of another group. I learned that they would not be able to come in such numbers and in such organizational structures without the help and without the encouragement of states, their original states or others. So when I started looking at the Afghan case, what really intrigued me was, why did they go? And how come people would leave everything behind them, their family, their country, their work, and go to an unknown territory, and only to fight a war that easily defined and understood by religious interpretations of a duty for every Muslim, or for Muslims in general. So the Afghan case is a very interesting one in terms of the scope and the time length that it was going on. It was a project administered by three powers: the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, who for almost a decade supported financially, militarily, and also in terms of facilitation of the travel and arrival of volunteers from various Arab countries to Afghanistan. Of course, the most important project was not helping Arab volunteers as such. The main project was helping the Mujahideen of Afghanistan. But as of 1984, thousands of Arab volunteers started to flock into Afghanistan, and more accurately, one should say, and I will return to this point, to Pakistan, and especially to Peshawar, on the very proximate to the Afghan border, from where all kinds of logistical activities and preparations, training, education, and so on and so forth of volunteers were conducted before these foreign fighters would go into Afghanistan. Okay? We are talking here about states, organizations, individuals, and I would call this phenomenon in general a transnational social movement, because the background of many of the volunteers was Islamic groups in their original countries, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, or more militant groups such as Jihad and Al-Jamaa al-Islamiyya in Egypt, or other groups in North Africa, Syria, or even in the Gulf. The scope of the phenomenon by itself is really unusual and needs to be presented. The numbers, according to the literature, are different, but the minimum that people are talking about is something like 7,500 volunteers, and some even speak about 50 or 70 or 100,000. The problem is we really don't know the numbers, because many people used to come to Pakistan, present themselves as volunteers, maybe entering into Afghanistan for a few days and returning to their countries with the new title of Afghan Arab, which became a code name for someone who went there, who shouldered or participated in this all-Islamic effort, and when he went back home, it was an additional kind of value of prestige, of social status even. During this period of time, from the early 1980s to even the early 90s, namely even after the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in '89, people still continued to go to Afghanistan because the war against the communist government in Afghanistan continued, even though the Soviets were out. For example, a name which I believe is familiar to you, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, who led the Al-Qaeda in Iraq under the post-Saddam Iraq from 2004 until he died. He was killed in 2006. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi arrived in Afghanistan pretty late, in 1989, which was just about the time when the Soviets decided to leave. And so were some other people like him. During this time, the whole concept of jihad changed. And I'll return to this point because it's very important. And the change was deliberate, and it was reshaped by Islamic scholars who were not necessarily part of any official system, but simply people who came from below, so to speak. But then the governments sort of adopted the idea for their own purposes and encouraged it. The dynamics of this phenomenon is, in my view, extremely important. Not only because it gave birth to Al-Qaeda and its other extensions, but because it has to do something to do with the relationship between states and social movements, especially Islamic social movements, and more specifically militant Islamic movements. Just to make sense of what I'm saying, the Afghan project of volunteering to fight against the Soviets was part of a process in which states had to cope with a growing phenomenon of Islamic opposition, Islamic radicalism, which in my view came to a point of boiling at the end of the 1990s, and in which governments, in fact, scored a decisive victory over these movements, to the extent that in 1999 in Egypt, the Gamaa al-Islamiyya and the Jihad announced a unilateral ceasefire. And 2 years later, in Algeria, even the GIA, the Group Islamique Armée, did the same thing. So in a way, the story of the Afghan Arabs combines and is part of the story of how states in the Middle East, at least, cope with this phenomenon of militant, armed sometimes Islamic groups. So in every way, this is a very interesting international as well as domestic phenomenon, which, in my view, also has to do with the problematic approach of IR theory to the issue of transnational movements, which is by and large conceived as excluded from the discussion about the state. And what I try to show is that states and transnational movements actually had a lot to do together, and their activities many times combined, either in the context of cooperation or in the context of conflict. So, as I said earlier, the literature really gives a very little attention to the background of these people who went abroad, looking for an arena where they could express themselves as jihadists, as people who dedicate their life and know that they might not come back from that battleground. How did they go? Why did they go? What did they do while they were in the battleground itself? And what were their relationships with the states of origin before, during, and after that period of volunteering and fighting? Because in many cases, we will see that when the war ends in Afghanistan, when the war ends, these people do not necessarily come back home or go back home. They many times remain where they are, maybe reshaping their activities or their objectives. And many of those who did return were received with a very harsh treatment of the state as a threat to the state. So what we see here is a fluctuating relationship from adversarial to cooperative to once again adversarial. So my main argument here is that despite the ostensible contradiction between the state and transnational movements in terms of loyalties, in terms of define in a way the state boundaries and the state authority by taking the effort from the state out and doing something that is not necessarily at the interest of the state. This kind of relationship reflects a complex relationship between state and society. If we take the Islamic movements as a representation of society as opposed to the state. And in this relationship you have mutual constitutive relationships. Namely, sometimes the state is willing to let go, turn a blind eye to all kinds of activities, only because the state needs the legitimacy from even those groups. And sometimes the state limits or represses these groups because of, again, self-interest. So what I will try to do is to show how this model or how this complex model of relationship works in the case of the Afghan volunteers. The existing explanations are quite insufficient, to say the least. The simplest explanation is, okay, the governments of the Arab world, be it Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Algeria, they were actually trying to get rid of the troublemakers, and so they let them go. It's undeniable that this consideration was there, but it's definitely not the whole story. Another explanation is that the jihadists themselves were looking for an outlet from an area or a situation of repression and persecution by the state. So by going to another territory, another country, especially a country with weak or non-existent government, some kind of a lawless and no man's land where they could flourish, where they could get organized and operate without the fear and actual repression of the state. Think about, for example, the role of Iraq in the 2000s for many such groups. Think about Lebanon during the civil war with a failed government or a failed state, as we call it. Such arenas became a hub for all kinds of anarchists and people who came from all over the world to replace their bad circumstances and situation in their countries of origin and get training, get better connection with other revolutionary groups. And even if this was a temporary refuge, many of them were thinking about returning to their homes stronger, more coherent, and hardened in terms of the solidarity among their members. Now, why would people go to such missions? And here I give a lot of significance to ideology, to what drives both individuals and groups. And primarily, of course, in this case, it's the Muslim solidarity with other Muslims. But there was also something that the literature hardly really elaborates, and this is the American pressure on its allies to share and to support this effort. Because initially, the whole idea of supporting the Mujahideen, the Afghan Mujahideen, the original Afghan Mujahideen, was an American idea. And it started even before the Soviet invasion, when Zbigniew Brzezinski, the president advisor on national security affairs in the United States, came with the idea of entangling the Soviet Union in a way that would be similar to what happened to the United States in Vietnam. He said, let's give them their Vietnam. And so even before the invasion or on the 31st of December, 1979, Americans begin to, I know this word is not very academic, but in this case it was really conspire to create the situation which would attract the Soviets in, and then of course create a guerrilla war against them, which would make their life very, very difficult. By the way, just I will tell you a story that would sound like almost a joke. 2 years ago, the Qatari foreign minister was interviewed about the support of Qatar for volunteers who went to Afghanistan in this period of time. And they asked him, so what was it? How the government supported, and was it out of Islamic solidarity? And he said, yeah, Islamic solidarity, but you know what he said? The most important thing was, we simply provided what the Americans asked us to provide. He said, we are like a gas station. A customer comes into the gas station and we fill in the tank because we are just providers. And he wanted basically to say that, and I don't think he meant to entirely abolish the significance of ideology, but he wanted to say that the state per se was doing what it did according to or based on the American request. Now, a few words about the model of state society, or rather what Joel Migdal coined as state in society. The idea is basically that in developing regions where regime legitimacy is low, where the state is a new phenomenon, post-colonial, and not entirely rooted in the say collective awareness and consciousness, where the economic situation is not great, and where the governments are unable to provide and to fulfill their duties in simple terms of giving the population even the basic
health, education, and other services. In those cases, the state is perceived not as a prominent actor, but rather as one of the social actors in the environment that we call a state. In other words, the state competes with other social actors or social agents for legitimacy and for survival. And in this game, the state keeps aligning itself with certain groups in order to make it possible to cross hard times and get more sort of time, gain time in terms of survival. Let me give you one example which is very well known in the literature. When President Sadat, or when Sadat became a president in Egypt in 1970, following Jamal Abdel Nasser, the first thing he does in that context was to release the Muslim Brotherhood leaders from jail after a long period of brutal repression by the Abdel Nasser regime. And he basically allies himself with the Muslim Brotherhood as a counterweight to the leftist nationalist groups who were identified with Jamal Abdel Nasser. So for him to survive in power needed, according to his own perception, of course, to shift alliances with other social forces. Of course, it was not without an influence also on foreign relations, because unlike Jamal Abdel Nasser, allying himself with the Muslim Brotherhood also meant closer relationship with Saudi Arabia, for example, which basically led later on to the connection with the United States. But I'm just giving an example to show a basic concept that the state is not an omnipotent actor that articulates ideas and shapes the society's sort of behavior and sets priorities for society, but rather another really actor in a complex game in which many other social groups and social forces take part. The historical background of the phenomenon that I'm talking about, of course, has to do with the sharp rise in the 1970s of Islamism in many Arab countries. In Saudi Arabia, already in the 60s, the input of the state in encouraging the Wahhabi concept of missionary Islam, not only in the Muslim world, but way beyond in Europe and in the Western Hemisphere in general. And with the money that the Saudis could pour into this effort, they could reach out to communities and regions which were previously very difficult to reach. The central current, the mainstream of Islamism in many Arab countries, however, remained identified with the Muslim Brotherhood, whose origin, as you all know, is Egypt, but from the 1930s on, it spread over many other countries. And the main concept of the Muslim Brotherhood was Islamization of society from below. Although they really never, even in the 40s or already in the 40s, they never disqualified the idea or the possibility of taking part in political life too. But their basic concept was education, preaching, and community Islamic life in order to Islamize society from below. During the time of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Islamic Brotherhood, there was also the idea of renewing the caliphate, which, as you all know, was abolished in 1924 by the Turkish government of, under Ataturk nomination. But in this context, the interesting thing is that the 70s also witnessed the rise of a new concept of jihad, connected to the interpretations and the exegetic input of Ibn Taymiyyah, who lived in the Middle Ages in the 13th century in Egypt, and the ethos of defensive jihad, namely what Muslims are supposed to do when their territory or one of their territories was invaded or captured by non-Muslims. How this would project itself on the Islamic world in general. What would it mean in terms of the duty of Muslims to recapture, to get organized, and how, on what basis, individual, collective, and so on. And in Egypt especially, in the 1970s, we have a very interesting development of Islamic radical movements who gradually go from opposition to the state to the interpretation of jihad, not necessarily or not primarily as an effort against the infidels, those who are enemies of Islam, those who are defined as Dar al-Harb, the house of war, but rather against those Jahiliyyah leaders who rule the Muslim world, but who do not implement Sharia and who do not keep up with the Muslim traditions. And so it was Sayyid Qutb, whom I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, know about, who in the mid-60s already following Ibn Taymiyyah, and to some extent Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi from Pakistan, who actually wrote in his famous book, Signposts, that jihad was something that Muslims are allowed to use against even their rulers if they do not go or keep up with the Islamic law, that they have the right. But in the course of the 70s, it develops into the missing duty. And the one who really gave it the most vivid and clear interpretation was Abdus-Salam Faraj, the founder of the Islamic Jihad organization in Egypt, who turned it into a duty, which he called the missing duty, namely that under circumstances of rulers who do not obey or who do not follow the Islamic law, it was the duty of the individual to fight them. And it was in that time that the idea of an internal jihad started to flourish in these countries. And the late 70s were very interesting in that sense. In November 1979, you have the attempt by visionary militant Islamists to take over the Al-Kaaba compound, which was a big shock for the Saudis. And as you know, it went on for about 2 weeks, and only after the Saudis had to invite advisors from France who artificially converted to Islam just for the moment that they were involved in that effort, not actively, but at least in terms of giving advice. So this was one case. in February that year, the Shiite revolution took place in Iran. And at the end of that year came the invasion of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which created a sense of emergency, so to speak, among many Muslim communities and regimes, especially in this context, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, and Egypt. Of course, in 1981, President Sadat was assassinated. The assassins came from primarily the Jihad organization, and this was, of course, perceived as an additional sign or evidence that the threat was real and significant. Now, when we speak about jihadists as opposed to and Muslim Brotherhood, mainstream, we have to remember that the differences are very, very important. Until today, the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Egypt, for example, represents primarily middle class, more educated, urban, but not only people. People who, in many cases, have property and have something to lose if they collide head-on with the government. While those who established the Jihad and Jama'ah al-Islamiyya and other even more radical groups came from the Sa'id, from the southern part of Egypt, the poorer one, the less developed, the less educated. Many of these youngsters who migrated into the centers of Cairo, in Alexandria, in the Delta, they were those who established and radicalized Islamic ideas during the 70s and early 80s. But these activities were not confined only to Egypt or Saudi Arabia. In 1982, in February 1982, in Hama, in Syria, the government repressed brutally a rebellion of the Muslim Brotherhood against the government with unknown number of casualties, but something that is anywhere between 15 to 25,000 dead people. Another important element here is the connection between Islamists who came from Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. Not only that migrants who went from Egypt and other poor countries to Saudi Arabia for work, who were affected and influenced by the Wahhabi idea or ideas, but also teachers who came from Syria, from Egypt, from other countries into Saudi newly established higher education institutions brought led to the emergence of a big community of young generation in Saudi Arabia who within less than a decade doubled and tripled itself in size, and many of them who came from the less developed areas, many of them, by the way, descendants of Yemenite migrants who were always the underdogs in Saudi society, became involved in those activities of radical Islamic propaganda and preaching, and which was mainly confined to the universities. But later on, we will see how the government actually would capitalize on this growth of Islamism among the students in order to propagate the idea of go to Afghanistan. Now Afghanistan is the priority. Now, there is a growing body of literature nowadays speaking about why people would go and bomb themselves, or why people would go and risk their life for something that is really not going to give them necessarily any substantial or tangible benefit. And there is a growing tendency among psychologists to combine the individual and the collective altruism. In other words, I want to do something for the sake not only of myself, in order to become a shaheed or something like this, but also for the sake of the collective. So this kind of selfish altruism, I want to be considered by the society as someone who undertook this mission for the sake of the collective, in this case for the ummah, for the Muslim nation. Now, when the war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union started, Islamic leaders Muslim leaders took very different views to this event. The most important thing that in this context is that the Saudis, with Sadat, started gathering energies and through propaganda and through military support to the mujahideen in Afghanistan in order to, first of all, help themselves, but also help this rebellion against the Soviets and the communist government in Kabul. But generally speaking, the state did not or could not control the volunteer movement, at least not on every individual. So many volunteers, for example, would go for Hajj to Mecca. And from Mecca, they would take a flight to Pakistan, and from there, they would be free. Although there are quite a lot of evidence that states continue to follow and to gather intelligence over these volunteers, even when they were in Pakistan. And this was not only Arab countries, but also Pakistan itself, who did not want the Islamic Party to take part in the violent activities, but rather to contain themselves with logistical activities. But I want to say a few words about Abdullah Azzam, who definitely is considered the architect and the projector of the idea of Afghan Arab volunteers. Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian who grew up in the West Bank before 1967, later in Jordan. He was a scholar who studied in Damascus and later on in Cairo, did his PhD in theology, and through his travels in the Arab world, he made connections with very many scholars and activists in the Islamic communities in many countries. He also studied and taught in Saudi Arabia, where some people say where he met bin Laden. But in any case, he was a typical person who was at the center of networks of scholars and Islamic political activists. And this is what may explain also his success in raising funds, in recruiting candidates for going to Afghanistan, in propagating the idea of jihad, which he was the inventor of. And it sounds a bit weird that we are talking about inventing the idea of jihad again. It was a reinvention of the idea of jihad. Jihad, at that time, as I mentioned before, was perceived by radical or militant Islamic groups as something that was directed inside, into the state, namely against the non-Islamic rulers. But what Abdullah Azzam did, and this was his main input, was to redirect jihad to what some called the far enemy, again. Namely, Afghanistan is now occupied by the Soviets. It's the primary mission of any Muslim, of every Muslim, man, woman, child, slave, according to the tradition, to go and fight without asking the government, without asking any authority, without doing anything in that context. So the support given to Abdullah Azzam by other prominent scholars in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Algeria, in Egypt, helped him a lot in disseminating this new call for Muslims to go and fight what he described as the first priority for the Islamic nation. Now, what happened during the 80s was that apart from what governments did or didn't do, was the involvement, which was broad and very substantial in scope, of Islamic associations. As you know, Islam is primarily interested in the social concerns of society. And you find in every Islamic society lots of associations that deal with charity, with support of the poor, with all kinds of other social activities. But there are also semi-official associations, such as, for example, the Red Crescent Association in many countries. And you have many other associations that collect and distribute money or have connections abroad in Europe or in the Western Hemisphere. So the state, in most of the cases, prefer to work through these associations, which, by the way, had a large chunk of their budgets from the state itself. And in Saudi Arabia, especially in the 1980s, you can see a lot of propaganda going on in the universities, in the campuses, to encourage people to go to Afghanistan. So, in addition to the ideological element of propagating the idea of jihad as something that has to happen there, not here, not in our domain, but there, there was something else. And this was the huge material support. Yes, Arab rulers did not want the volunteers to be involved in combat activities, but they couldn't control it. And when people went there, in the case of Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was a member of the Jihad group, was arrested for a short time, actually less than 2 years. In '83, he already goes to Afghanistan as a volunteering doctor to treat wounded and sick people. Then he comes back to Egypt, and then he started organizing his group, or members of his group, to go again to Afghanistan, this time as combatants. From 1984, you can see a sharp rise in the number of volunteers because of the establishment of the Bureau of Services by Abdullah Azzam, and apparently with help of Osama bin Laden, who became increasingly involved in these activities. And Osama bin Laden represents, even though he is a very unique representation, but he represented the type of person who was go-between government and volunteers. He himself was a son of a very rich family, close to the royal family, with lots of business interests in Saudi Arabia and out of Saudi Arabia. And bin Laden could bring into this effort the richness of his family, but also the equipment sometimes to pave roads into Afghanistan and to create or to establish bases and so on and so forth. But the most important thing for me is to see bin Laden as a representative of the persona who could talk on the one hand with the royal family of Saudi Arabia and of course encourage and mobilize support, and at the same time be in the terrain and work together and even fight with the volunteers who came from the Arab countries. So the Bureau of Services became really the center of logistics and organization for those who poured into Pakistan, and at least for some of them, this was just a station or a first stop before they would go into Afghanistan to fight. To make it very clear, by the way, the Islamic volunteers who came from the Arab world to fight in Afghanistan, when they met with the Afghan mujahideen and were asked, what are you doing here? Why did you come? We don't really need people. What we need is equipment, we need money, we need arms. So the answer, according to one of the volunteers who wrote his memoirs, came from Egypt. He said, it's not only that jihad needs men, sometimes men need jihad. And this is for me a motto of what jihad means for not only individuals, but also for Islamic groups as such. I want to say a few words about what happened after the war, and with this I'll close my presentation. The return to the original countries, as I said, was met with harsh treatment. Many of these people were arrested, interrogated. In Egypt, they were even put to court. Some were executed. And here's the point, that even in the 90s, when they had to leave, the volunteers had to leave Afghanistan, because in 1992, a national Afghan Islamic government came into being, and the Afghan mujahideen did not want these volunteers, so they sent them back home. But these volunteers could not go back home because of what was waiting for them. So many of them were actually invited to Sudan by Hassan al-Turabi, who at that time was the main Islamic figure and part of the ruling machine. And they considered this as a second hijrah. Namely, the first hijrah was to Afghanistan. Now they were migrating to Sudan. And until 1996, when the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, they stayed in Sudan and tried to continue their war against their national countries of origin. In other words, Egyptians fought against Egypt, Libyans against Libya, Sudanese, who were also part of the group but hid in Sudan, also tried to continue to fight against Sudan. Same thing with Algerians, Yemenites, and so on. In other words, it was the national agenda that kept informing these people and directing their activities. Still no global agenda whatsoever during those years. It was only after they went back to Afghanistan, because the Sudanese at some point decided that they couldn't take the cost of their presence in Sudan in terms of the pressures of the international communities and also of the neighboring Arab countries. And it was only then when they went back to Afghanistan and this convergence of jihadists who came from Arab and non-Arab countries and created what is called the new Ummah, the new nation of Islam, when these groups started to, especially under the influence of Ayman al-Zawahiri, to develop the idea that actually the best way to continue fighting their governments was not to collide head-on with nation states such as Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Algeria, but to target Western interests in and out of these countries. As you all know, 1996 came the first fatwa of bin Laden together with Saddam Hussein, and then in 1998, the second fatwa, which defined the Crusaders and the Jews as the main target of jihad. And in my view, it was a default choice. It was not necessarily that all of a sudden jihad changed its interpretation. Of course, they continued the idea of Azam, who was, by the way, assassinated in 1989, and nobody knows why or by whom. My choice, or my first guess, is that it was Pakistan who accounted for this assassination, but of course I don't have any proofs for this. And the main reason is that the states did not want these volunteers to continue jihad. They wanted them to go out of Pakistan and Afghanistan. They wanted to eliminate this phenomenon because they had already attained their goal of kicking the Soviets out of Afghanistan. But it was the idea of Azam that was reinterpreted. And Azam spoke about the need to fight everywhere, in any territory, from Spain to Bulgaria to, of course, Palestine, in order to retrieve the Islamic territory from the hands of the infidels who took over such territories. So, in my view, the national rationale continues to lead many of these volunteers, but the way to achieve the change that they envision is not necessarily through straight and head-on collision with their original governments, but now they learn to combine international with national activities. Okay? So I'll stop here. I know I took more than the time given to me, but I hope you can have time.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Sedla. I'll open it up for questions in a sec. I just had a couple comments, first of all. From the presentation, one thing that is very important in my own work is this combination, or this conceptual combination of theory and case study work. So from my perspective, that's where I was looking, because that's my own academic perspective. So some things that when I'm doing this myself, what I think about is the first thing you need to make sure is that you're not searching for certain theories. Okay, you're not trying to pluck out certain theories, and this was definitely something I did not see, which is great, in the presentation of Dr. Sedla. At some points you're a historian, at some points you're a sociologist, at some points I see a little bit of anthropology. I know you're a political scientist by trade, but the sort of intertwining of disciplines I think is very important when you're looking at theory. You don't want to get pigeonholed. Second of all, in regards to the case studies, I think you have to ask why, okay? Assumptions or judgment calls are not good, especially when you're looking at sensitive issues like Al-Qaeda, for example. So I think that's very good in your presentation. You're asking why in terms of these transnational state relationships without assuming some sort of linear development, which I thought was great as well. You need to know the theories, which I felt like you had a great background of them. You also need to be critical, which I definitely saw that in terms of IR theory. Talking about traditional political IR theory, in terms of this sort of, that we can't think of transnational groups and states on the same level. Fluidity is, reality, more or less, that these transnational groups are sometimes acting as state actors, sometimes they're not. So fixed national or fixed entities is not the way things work in reality. So that approach I think was very important as well. Now, is that enough, knowing the theories and just having that sort of scholarly basis? No, you need to know the case studies, and that's basically where you start. And that was one thing I thought was very important, your weaving of the case studies of understanding the Afghani case, and also tying that to the sort of international, regional, local issues, also in regards to what Islamic scholars were saying about this and how this concept of jihad was created. Another question of why. And then you need to be able to intertwine the theories and the case studies, and make it almost seamless. And this was something I saw. I was thinking to myself, when you would say something, this sounds like a theory, say, on cultural boundaries, or how identities shift between, what would be considered state boundaries and how they shift. But you didn't have to mention that. It was fluid enough. So this fluidity is extremely important. And then you need to create a fluid narrative of it, which was what we saw in this presentation. So great job on that. That's basically what I wanted to say on that. One thing, this is a comment and a question. One thing I found in my own search of works that do this well in terms of intertwining theory and case studies, one thing that I think helps in the best works that I like are ones that apply or use ethnography. Okay, with non-state actors, gangs, etc. Spending time with these gangs or with these groups is extremely important to understand how they think about things. Obviously, in this aspect, you can't do that. You mentioned memoirs, okay, but I wanted to know what the possibility would be of interviews, perhaps with Afghani Arabs that fought as foreign fighters, and perhaps a critical take on these narratives to figure out, these memoirs. What were these people thinking? That was one aspect I had. So that was the first question, and then just one quick other question. I wanted to see how you thought the concept of jihad stands in 2011. We have Al-Qaeda sort of compartmentalized in ways, even though it's still a global movement. You have Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, and people say that is very different from Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. You have Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. You have Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. How can there be is there one formal way of talking about jihad within the context of Al-Qaeda when you have all these different groups? So those were my two questions. Thank you very much for the presentation. Really appreciated it.
Should I?
Yeah, you can respond to those, and then we will move to other questions if that's okay.
Okay. In terms of sources, I mentioned memoirs, but actually this study covered a whole range of memoirs, not only by volunteers or people who were involved in this effort, but also of for example, American CIA or officials who were somehow involved in this project. Secondly, I went over the publication of the Bureau of Services in Peshawar, which published a journal. In the beginning it was quite irregular, but then it became a monthly, very regularly published from 1984 until the early 90s. I have most of the issues. I couldn't find all the issues, but more than 90% of the issues I could collect from various universities and libraries over the world. And they covered the ongoing events in Afghanistan. They published obituaries of volunteers who martyred in the battleground, and gave stories about their lives and their motivations, which of course should be taken very carefully, because the tendency is to glorify and to make the volunteer a hero and someone who came only for the purpose of istishhad, of martyrdom. But nevertheless, this was a very, very important source for me to use. The Bureau of Services published another journal for a shorter period of time, which was also very, very important. But the Arab press was another serious and very important source for me, because many people covered the long jihad in Afghanistan as journalists, as people who became involved. And some people, by the way, stayed since then until now, and they keep looking into the situation and report the ongoing events on the internet. So they have websites,
One another source of information for me was, for example, lists of the dead, of the martyrs who died in Afghanistan, and which various associations published on the website in order to simply commemorate these people. So again, there is a short biography on everyone, and so by collecting them and analyzing them, you can really get a good sense of who they were, where did they come from, and even create a profile of what was the typical volunteer in terms of age, education, social and economic background. So all this I did, but I couldn't talk, of course, about all these things. There are a number of books written by people who spend time in Afghanistan as journalists or as people who themselves were volunteers. For example, there's an Egyptian by the name Daraz who published no less than 8 booklets of 40 to a little bit more than 100 pages each. And in each one, he gives a different perspective on the whole phenomenon of volunteers in Afghanistan. So I don't think, as an Israeli, I have much of a chance to interview Muslim volunteers to either Afghanistan or Iraq, but and these are the limitations of an Israeli who dares sticking his neck into this field. But with all the limitations, I have a feeling that I could do something, at least to contribute something into this field.
And then the issue of Al-Qaeda?
Oh, Al-Qaeda, yeah, sure. Actually, there is a growing agreement among people who study this issue of Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-like organizations that you can find nowadays more people who identify actively with these groups in Europe rather than in the Middle East itself. Yes, we have a number of cases of groups, for example, very near to where I live and exist in Israel, in Gaza Strip. Shortly after the Hamas took over in mid-2007, new Islamic jihadist groups emerged. In the beginning, they were very small, and I think until now they are quite limited in terms of their membership and so on. But they call themselves in all kinds of names, and they at least give the impression that they not belong, but they are like Al-Qaeda. They don't get any instructions from Al-Qaeda. They don't have any hierarchical relationships with Al-Qaeda, but they try to be much to the right of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and present themselves as groups with an agenda that goes way beyond fighting Israel. Namely, that it is also against the Crusaders, and they use the same terminology. And even in Gaza, Hamas collides with them head on. And a few months ago, there was a big clash with one of those groups in Khan Yunis, in the southern part of Gaza Strip. We have them in Yemen, of course, the Houthis. We have them in the Maghreb as local groups. I think that, yes, they do exist, but in Iraq they have almost entirely eliminated or ceased to operate, mainly because the population itself and the community itself, how to say this, made them created conditions that were very difficult for them to continue their activities. This was one of the ways by which the American forces in Iraq really managed to shift the picture from one where they had to fight against every such group into something that would be much easier to deal with by cooperating with the community itself, with chiefs of tribes and local chieftains and so on and so forth. On the contrary, in Europe today, you have hibernating cells, apparently. And once and again, you can see that because of the conditions of the world which we live nowadays, where people migrate for labor or for other purposes, you can find Muslims almost in every country in the world. And as Olivier Roy, in his second most important book, I think, in this context, Globalized Islam, says that the generation of jihadists nowadays is those people who grew up in the West, but they cannot connect to any reality of family or any kind of social connection to the locals because they feel estranged or they feel assimilated, discriminated against, and they develop this mood of which becomes very, very important to recruit them for such missions. It doesn't mean that, of course, only a few people go and choose these activities, but many of them are not active, but they concentrate around Islamic centers in Britain, in France, in Germany, and whether or not and when they might erupt with violence, that's another question. I think that the Western world has learned a great deal how to cope with this phenomenon, something that was not very clear in the early 2000s. And I think even in the States nowadays, there is much more a sense of confidence that the system learned how to deal with this problem. I know simply from close connection with some FBI circles in the States about tremendous changes in terms of research, in terms of really redirecting the activities of certain parts of the FBI to look into these terrorist activities rather than just criminal activities. So I think the world is more and more prepared to deal with those things. And as I said, I believe that in terms of the Arab world, of course, with the upheavals recently, it's too early to forecast or to prophesize what's going to happen. Definitely, Yemen can become a new hub of such a phenomenon. Even in Egypt, one cannot exclude the possibility that because of the changes, the revolution, the weakening government, or the weakened government, these elements can return and find their space. In Libya, for example, whether or not the allegation of Gaddafi that there are foreign fighters is true or not, that's another question. But the situation of a failed state or a weak central government definitely encourages these elements. And as I say, I don't want to go into this. It's too new. It's too. We don't have a good sense of what's really going on in these countries. You said that I combine history. I very much appreciate a good and in-depth study of cases before we jump into theories and to conclusions.
Well, thank you so much for your stuff. You had a question?
Hi, I'm Faiza from the Middle East Institute, and I appreciate your well-rounded lecture. Just wanted to, you mentioned, Sayyid Qutb and his book Ma'alim Fit Tariq. I think you got the translation right. It's like more well known as Milestones in English. Yeah. Just wanted to ask, how, like you were mentioning about how Muslims in the West are facing this disconnect from probably local customs and traditions or maybe lifestyle. How do you see Said Qutb in this regard? He's considered by some scholars and even terrorist groups as like the father of modern Islamic terrorism. Do you see him as somebody who was trying to grapple with himself as a strict Muslim in a society that's highly opening to Western, in a against a backdrop of colonization, and in a society that was slowly opening to Western cultures and values, Egypt at that time. And I think he spent some time in the States too, and he was he experienced what we could call culture shock. Do you see him as somewhat, his writings as a product of that context, or do you see him simply as really the father of modern Islamic terrorism? Just wondering, because I haven't quite made up my mind about him yet, so just wanted to hear your view. Thanks.
I think that a good understanding of Said Qutb has to take into consideration primarily the conditions within Egypt. Said Qutb was the main, or one of the main ideologists of the Muslim Brotherhood movement during the late 50s and early 60s, until he was trialed and executed in 1966. But thinking about the way the Nasserist regime repressed Muslim Brotherhood, to the extent that according to a number of records, Muslim Brotherhood members were assassinated while in prison and during interrogations. So the repression was tremendously brutal. And this is why, and I study other Islamic movements, and I see a connection between the way the state treats Islamists, or any opposition group, by the way, and the response of these groups to the government, and also the production of ideas. Said Qutb, I believe, spoke primarily from that point of departure. He saw in the Nasserist regime something evil, to the extent that even his, Nasser's vision of pan-Arab ideology seemed wrong and anti-Islamic. Said Qutb presents it as an attempt to alternate the Islamic idea of all Islamic solidarity with another idea which was basically secular, based on nationalism. But nowadays, for example, you can see that certain Islamic movements do cherish national ideology, and they actually combine Islamism with national liberation. And this goes back to Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi, who at the time of the Indian, of India under colonial rule of Britain, this was when he was in his 30s, he was the one who actually justified jihad as a means for national liberation. So these ideas come and go, I believe, very much according to the relationship with the state and with society in general. But I think Said Qutb, if he would be asked today, in heaven, did you establish, Islamic terrorism? He would be surprised, because what he wrote in his book, or his books, was actually an idea that was meant to warn the apostate rulers, rather than to call for a rebellion against the state. As you all know, in Islam, the basic rule is you have to obey the ruler, even if he is a tyrant, because everything is better than fawda, which is chaos. And because Islam has experienced so many infighting periods of time, they wanted so much to avoid it that it became kind of a basic tenet in Islam that fighting the ruler or opposing the ruler is something you have to be very, very careful about. So I think what the main contribution of Sayyid Qutb was in that context, that he returned to the sources of Ibn Taymiyyah and brought it again up at a time of, as I said, very, very brutal repression. But I'm not sure he would be happy to think that he was actually the one who showed the direction or the trajectory of Islamic terrorism. Some later ideologists made this much more closer to what we experience today or what we know today. And in Egypt of the 70s, the ideas of al-hijrah, takfir wal-hijrah, or the jihad and others, for example, Omar Abdurrahman had a much more important role in that sense because he actually gave specific justification by fatwas to members of the Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyah to use violence against state officials. Something which was maybe, deriving certain inspiration from Qutb's writings, but still it needed further interpretation and further influence of the circumstances in Egypt itself at that time, and also of the people and where they came from, who accounted for that interpretation. So I think it's a very, very complex, if we want to understand why at a certain time, certain place, certain people choose to take an idea this direction or that direction, we have to understand it as a much more complicated socio-political, economic, cultural, process.
A question over here. I can get it. Yeah, just identify yourself first.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Kasi Raja, an academic here. Thank you very much, Dr. Seda, for an enlightening talk. I see that you drew from a lot of sources about about volunteerism in Afghanistan. May I see some sort of common ground among the whole of humanity in regard to this concept of jihad, of volunteerism, of liberating a country from colonial rule, liberating, I'm thinking of India, I'm thinking of the United States War of Independence, and I'm also thinking of the concept of jihad, where you are asked to go and liberate another society from, using a neutral word, oppression. I think the vast common ground between terrorism, if I may venture, liberation, jihad, and freeing oneself from the oppression of rulers is the spirit of altruism in the human being. Surely a human being is driven by the ego of altruism, a moral drive towards a sense of rectitude, is it not? And when you are fired in that way, it starts off as a very noble idea, but then there are differences that lead to its being abused. Am I correct in seeing that way of analyzing the situation?
Okay, it's an amazing question, and even more than just a question. It's an amazing attempt to frame this phenomenon within a much, much wider context. And the cases you mentioned, by the way, like the American War of Independence, in which, for example, French volunteers took part, and I would add the
Revolution, yes.
the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, in which Americans came to fight on the side of the Republicans, and many volunteers from all over the world came to fight on the side of both sides, actually, the Republicans and the conservative, namely Franco and his colleagues. Before I start teaching, and I have a course at Hebrew University on radical Islam, and I call it radical Islam / adjustment, protest, or protest adjustment and violence. I don't use the word terrorism because I think from the viewpoint of Islam, this is not terrorism. This violence is the lesser evil in certain cases where the Muslim find himself obliged or have no other way of dealing with the situation. Because as you all know, according to Islamic concepts of the just war, the only just war is when it is for the sake of Allah, and not for just expanding one's territory necessarily, or taking any material advantage. So in that case, I'm not using the word terrorism. I'm using the word violence. When I start the part that deals with jihad, I go back to Frantz Fanon. Frantz Fanon was a volunteer to the Algerian War of Independence in the late 50s. He's from the Antillean islands by origin, a black African in origin, but he was a psychiatrist who wrote in his book, The Wretched of the Land, about the significance of violence as a liberating, cathartic sort of process of repressed people. And by the way, it's interesting how many national liberation movements adopted his writings and his idea in order to actually send the message that this was not just to get rid of the oppressor, but it was in order to lift the self-confidence of a people and create a nation of people who are proud of themselves and are capable of expressing their capabilities. In other words, violence as a liberating process of the individual as opposed of society. So in that sense, one can see the connection. I'm not sure we can easily, kind of create a common denominator for all those cases, but I think there is an important psychological, social, and this is why, to me, ideology is so important, because it gives a common ground of one's understanding what is the world about and what we are doing and what we should do, and in that context, the persona, the individual, should find a room for himself or for herself in a certain case, in certain cases, it's about resonance of who I am, what do I want to be, how I want the world to look like, and for example, in the Spanish Civil War, I have a few letters of volunteers who went there with the feeling that this was the most fateful and crucial event in the world that would, decide the future of the world between evil and good. And in many cases of these volunteers for jihad, there is this exactly the same vision that we are going to change the world. And in the case of Afghanistan, for example, Abdullah Azam spoke and wrote endlessly in many brochures that were published everywhere about creating once and for all a real Islamic state where people could find refuge and could live their lives as good Muslims without oppression. So his vision was without a caliphate, without any kind of great vision for the rise of the Muslim Ummah. Yes, it was there too, but he repeats itself. And in one of his writings, he says to recruit preachers and people who could teach Islam to the Afghan people, where Sufism and very basic Islamic culture existed, is more important than recruiting fighters. So in that sense, I think you can look at it from various angles and see that different groups or various groups emphasize different elements, but altogether, I think there is a sense of faithfulness that unless we do it now, something very bad would happen, or this is a mission that we have to fulfill, and we should do it because we are those who are endowed with this by the way we are, or who we are, and who we want to be. So there is a mixture of I think individual and group and more than a group. I mean, it's a transnational phenomenon. When we talk about the Spanish Civil War, and this was before the word transnationalism came into even the vocabulary of scholars, you see people who come from Russia and from Poland and from Britain and from Palestine going to fight in Spain, with the same ideology of the socialist, more kind of liberal, open society, as some people understood it, regardless of what the Soviet Union understood in all this, because the Soviet Union was a main contributor and main force pushing people to go to Spain. But it's a very interesting attempt to bring all those together. And yes, when you look at the volunteers who went to Afghanistan, they themselves speak about their motivation as a combination of, on the one hand, repression, on the other hand, their vision of wanting to be good members of the Islamic community, and as such, they felt solidarity with a repressed people of Islam in some other place. And of course, to this you can add the needs of governments, the needs of certain preachers. Azam definitely had a vision that the Afghan war could be a tremendous process of revivalism, for the whole Muslim world. So there is a range of causes and interpretations and visions that is involved. But it's very difficult to put all this together and say that we can combine the cases of more liberal societies, for example, the American War of Independence, or the Spanish War, with those cases of jihad or global jihadism or transnational jihad. But there are many elements. That's why I'm so attracted to draw a comparison between cases, historical cases. I'm not sure I satisfied you with my answer, but I think it's very difficult to really sort of...
I don't want to monopolize, but then subject to what the others say, I will have to sum up. Oh, well, obviously, I'm thinking of instinctively, I don't relish war, I don't relish conflict. And it's very messy. Undoubtedly, there have been a tremendous amount of messing up by jihad concepts, with great respect. The American War of Independence, its loss of life, should we not reach a stage, or are we not reaching a stage where there is a need for some sort of world body, the UN of course, the UN model, and dispute resolution procedures such as the International Court of Justice that could help in maintaining a certain degree of peaceful equilibrium between the respective different groups, I'm not saying conflicting groups, in a way in which perhaps we could have some sort of imposition of compromises from a world body. Here I am really harking back to the principle that you referred to, obedience to the ruler. Right or wrong, the ruler ought to be obeyed. Of course, if the ruler is altruistic and paternalistic, there is no problem. And I consider that the time is now, the auspices are most favorable now for some sort of world body with the sanctions to impose their will in the cause of altruistic peace.
One of the courses I teach is about conflict and conflict management / resolution. And I think especially in that context, there has been on the one hand a very strong impact of such ideas, whether it is a global body that takes care of resolving conflicts or mitigating them, or even resolving problems within states by international intervention, humanitarian or else. And I think this was, if you look at the very beginning of the 90s, you would see a lot of publications in that direction of people who spoke primarily of that liberal vision of the responsibility to protect of President Wilson back then, which was revived with the fall of the Soviet Union. But then the experience, the real experience of intervening in other territories, because at some point you have to ask yourself, who should do the job and how the job can be done. The vision is right and there, but then somebody has to take undertake the mission, and this sometimes is conducted by force and sometimes by ways of conviction. But in many cases, during the 90s, even really leading powers failed again and again in making a difference in that context. The failures from Somalia to Rwanda to other cases of Sierra Leone and other places, even Yugoslavia, which is considered to some extent a success, came only after a tremendous cost was paid in the civil war. And then towards the late 90s and especially early 2000, you can see in the literature a tone of sort of awakening to the problems, to the difficulties, to the differences. Think about a coalition of states that are willing to take the mission of resolving a problem in a certain country. And the literature goes into such efforts and look into the problematics of coordination and of interests and conflicts, not only within the torn apart society, but also among those who are supposed to resolve the problem. That's one level. But there's another level. I remember many, many years ago, I met with a former defense minister of India who came to Israel for a visit, and we spoke about various approach to differences, conflict, and so on and so forth. And he said something that it was very early in my career. He said, look into the monotheistic religions and see how exclusive they are compared to other systems of belief, which tend to be more inclusive. And it's maybe not by coincidence that the idea of nonviolence in the context of conflict resolution was born in India and not in other places, or at least in India, it found the most conspicuous expression. And from there, it was imitated and adopted by many, many other groups and movements. So this belief that I'm the only one and everyone should line behind me because I'm speaking the truth and the only truth combines very well with Foucault's idea of, a regime of truth. And how do we do it? We do it by preaching, by discourse, by propagating the idea and making the other wrong, or by making the other less than what we are. And hence, of course, we say the word of God and nobody else. And that's why even within the monotheistic religions, you see this competition and this enmity, at least among certain groups. And I don't think that we should really too much exaggerate the significance of these extreme groups, of whether terrorists or people who do believe that their jihad is something that is a sacred duty. I think they represent the margins of societies. They represent very, very small, extraordinarily excluded from their own societies. One of the things that helped very much governments in the Arab world to fight this phenomenon of militant groups was that the society itself stood against these activities. And this is what made these governments capable of really repress or exclude or even really kick out or expel these groups. And nowadays, when we speak about the Muslim Brotherhood, we have to remember, for example, in Egypt, we have to remember that this is a process that led to screening out, as I call it, of the militant margins, and which left us with a mainstream of people who understand the need to refrain from violence and to keep up with the rules of the state and make the effort of achieving and attaining the intention of society without any unlawful way of action. So I'm very much with you in the sense that human beings have to be more aware of the not only need but also the possibility of resolving conflicts by way of dialogue, by way of peaceful means. The problem is we are talking about torn apart societies, very different systems of belief, of values, and unfortunately the experience of the last 2 decades, sort of since the fall of the Soviet Union, doesn't bid very well. I mean, even the largest power in the world, at least this is what we used to have to think until a few years ago, was not capable. Look at what happened in Iraq. Look at what happened in Afghanistan. If the United States is going to withdraw from Afghanistan within a few months, it's going to leave behind an arena that would definitely get back to violence and a lot of chaotic kind of social activity, whether political or economic or anything else. So there are still areas in the world which are very difficult to settle, and even large powers. I mean, and you know, we think that the world became more aware and willing to resolve problems like this, and yet the leading powers have difficulty to agree on something like resolving the conflict in Darfur, where Muslims kill Muslims only because the Muslims of Darfur are black, and the Muslims of Khartoum consider themselves Arabs. So this whole idea of cleavages that at some point boil down to violence, unfortunately, is going to accompany us for a long time, I'm afraid.
I'm optimistic, Dr. Sela. As you remember, drawing from the monotheistic religion, be ye perfect, as my Father is perfect. And talking about the polytheistic religion, an interesting comparison had been drawn by this academic or by this anecdotal evidence that you gave about an Indian leader who took up the position that because we have the polytheistic religion, we are a little bit more inclusive. But again, that's not the answer to the question. The answer to the question is not religion. If one talks about religion, that leads to religiosity, but it's a question of getting out the best in the human being. I posed my original question by saying that jihad concept and all that is a result of the human drive, the moral drive towards rectitude. So in that respect, I think we still have that moral drive, and it has to be nourished.
I only hope that we will see the future in the course of your vision, and I can only join this prayer.
On an optimistic note, we will end. Thank you so much, Dr. Sela, for your talk.
Thank
Let's
you.
all.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, and gift from the Middle East Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. So we can get a picture.
Oh,
Okay. We can hold the shake, sure. Very diplomatic of us.
okay.
Thanks. Do you have another one? Thank you. It was a great talk. Thank you so much. So nice to meet you.